Senator.
Hey, Sean. Thanks for having me.
I guess I should now say presidential candidate Rand Paul.
You know, you can still just call it Rand, John. We're going to keep it on first name basis.
So it's not going to make any difference? Well, you know,
I think I'm still the same as I was.
You know, it's funny because I said to the audience, I said, I don't think I ever went into a room where there was about to be a presidential announcement, and I've been through many presidential cycles in my life, and Metallica and Sandman is playing, pretty loudly, and apparently the crowd was loving it, a pretty young crowd there.
Yeah, well, we try to have good music, and so when my wife came out, she came out to Float On by Modest Mouse, and we had a cool instrumental version by the Edgar Winter Band called Frankenstein that I came out to, which was really neat song.
Yeah. Well, listen, for me, it's an exciting time, because here's why. I think that you represent the Republican Party that I think needs to be heard. I look at Senator Cruz. You and him pretty much have identical voting records. And you got Marco Rubio, and then you got all these governors that are going to come out there. And then I compare it to the so-called inevitable choice of the Democrats, which is Hillary Clinton. And I'm thinking it's just a far more dynamic group of people with a lot more energy and I think a lot better ideas in terms of solving our country's problems. So, you know, my first question to you is, what's the first 100 days of a Rand Paul presidency going to look like? What would you prioritize as our top problems?
You know, I think the energy of our country and the job-creating mechanism of the country comes from the private sector. So the first thing I would do is say we have to reduce taxes. We have to leave more money in the private sector. I would say, second one, you can't spend money you don't have. So you can't borrow your way to prosperity. We should quit spending money we don't have. And in my announcement speech today, I said, look, can't we just settle on spending $3 trillion that comes in so we can survive on the $3 trillion that comes in rather than continuing to spend $3.8 trillion, $4 trillion when only $3 trillion comes in?
I think it's a good point. I mean, the next president, you become the next president of the United States, you're going to inherit $20 trillion in debt, $100 trillion in unfunded liabilities, and 50 million Americans in poverty, and 50 million on food stamps, and 93 million Americans out of the labor force. I mean, that almost seems insurmountable to me.
And the thing is what we haven't done is we haven't had a Republican who is boldly for using tax cuts to actually help people who are without jobs and to help people who live in poverty. So I have a specific plan to cut taxes in Detroit by $1.2 billion. So then Republicans would actually have a plan for helping Detroit to bail themselves out by lowering their taxes.
How do you go about getting at least a percentage of the 93 million out of the labor force back in, or a significant percentage of the people out of poverty, off of food stamps? I mean, what's the plan and how long does that take if you fully got Congress to cooperate with what you wanted to do?
Well, it's a big project. You know, Martin Luther King talks about there being two Americas. One America who believes in life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and the other America that's just kind of given up, that live in a daily state of despair. We have to give hope to those people and acknowledge that many of them do want jobs. And what we have to do is have economic policies that allow jobs to create. Reagan was the last real, true Republican who said we're going to dramatically cut taxes to create jobs. And then we gave up on that. Republicans became embarrassed to be for tax cuts. The Democrats said they're only for the rich. And what we need to do is explain to be that tax cuts can help Detroit, tax cuts can help Appalachia, tax cuts can help West Louisville. And I think that's the message that has been lacking.
One of the things I found most interesting in the lead-up to your announcement today is that you've been spending a lot of time speaking to groups that are not historically Republican, including historically black colleges. You made a statement that you're looking for working people, people with tattoos, no tattoos, earrings, no earrings, nose rings, no nose rings, ties, no ties, ponytails, no ponytails. And you say that you're a different kind of Republican. What does that mean?
Well, it means that we have to find people where they live, and we have to go to them in the way they lead their lives. And so what I've been saying to a lot of folks is that Republicans have been very good at defending the Second Amendment. I'm all in. I'm a big defender of the Second Amendment. we really miss within the whole Bill of Rights, and there are portions of the Bill of Rights that are there for people who live in poverty, who people might be falsely accused of a crime. The Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, the right to a trial by jury, the right to a lawyer, the right to privacy. All these other amendments actually have people who haven't traditionally been Republican who are interested in these issues, and I think the Republican Party needs to become a champion of the entire Bill of Rights.
You mentioned, I want to go back to the economy. You mentioned, can't we just live off $3 trillion? Well, you know how the narrative works every political election cycle is that if you even propose a reduction of the rate of increase based on baseline budgeting, there's going to be an image of Rand Paul throwing grandma, little kids off a cliff and saying that you want them to starve to death. How do you counter that false narrative that predictably comes up every single election cycle?
What I would say is I want to leave that money in areas where it's needed to help grandma. In areas where there's 20% unemployment like Detroit, I'd leave that money there. But I also would tell people that the numbers coming out of Washington that talk about cutting money are fake numbers. They're not real. They're talking about cutting rates of increase in spending. They're never really talking about cutting spending. Almost no cuts that are discussed in Washington are actually true cuts. Most of them are cuts in the rate of increase. And so even the sequester that everyone has talked about, the sequester over 10 years is a reduction in the rate of increase. In fact, Fox News has had this and shown the graph many times. Without the sequester, they show the curve, and they show just a very, very almost inseparable difference with the curve for sequester, and it's just barely less spending than what we're spending, but it was at least a reduction in the rate of growth.
The latest polls have you beating Hillary Clinton in states like Washington, Colorado. I believe you're doing well in New Hampshire and Ohio as well. Why do you think you match up well against her in these polls?
We think we do well in these blue and purple states because we attract a lot of independent voters. And really that needs to be part of the process on who we decide will be the Republican nominee, is trying to get somebody who actually can win in the purple states. This is the states you have to win ultimately to be able to win the general elections. The red states are easy. So slinging red meat in the red states is fine, but what we have to do is find a candidate who will stay true to principle, but also can extend that message of liberty to a new constituency of people.
It's possible. I know you've done all this outreach to these historically black colleges, but yet every election, the black vote in America tends to go 90% for the Democratic presidential candidate. Do you think you can change that, and how do you change that?
If you poll a general African-American audience, about a third of them are actually very conservative or significantly conservative on a variety of issues. The problem is that they don't believe the Republican Party cares about them. They don't believe the Republican Party wants to help them. And if we can get beyond whether or not we care, whether or not we want to help, and actually talking about issues, I think you'll find that a significant number of African Americans could switch in one election cycle. The last time we had a transformation like this was 1932. Two-thirds there were a black vote in 1928 was Republican. In 1932, it switches to two-thirds Democrat and came back in one election. What the Republicans need is a transformative candidate and a transformational election where African Americans, Hispanics, others, young people, all of a sudden say, the Democrats just aren't really competing for my vote. They don't care enough about my vote anymore. I'm switching.
What do you make of Hillary Clinton and the many troubles she has? You have the Clinton Foundation, monies that she's taken from countries like Saudi Arabia, Oman, the UAE, with their atrocious records on women's rights, and gays and lesbians. What do you make about her Benghazi, the handling or lack of handling of Benghazi, her server destroyed? What do you make of the problem she's facing, and is she a weakened candidate?
I've asked Hillary Clinton to return the money to Saudi Arabia, to Brunei, to Oman. The reason she should return the money is that it sends a terrible signal to these Stone Age type of regimes that have no women's rights. In Saudi Arabia, a woman was raped by 7 men, and then she was arrested and given 90 lashes for being in the car with an unmarried man. What kind of signal does it show when Hillary Clinton accepts money from this Stone Age regime? She took money from Brunei, from the Sultan of Brunei, And in Brunei, you can be stoned to death for adultery. Women don't sit on juries, women don't vote, and you can probably guess who makes the accusations on adultery, the men. So how she could take this money with a straight face and act as if she's going to be a champion of women's rights is beyond me, and I'm going to continue to call that she return the money.
We'll get into this in more detail because we have it for the full hour tonight on Hannity, but we do have some Iranian news today, and that is that the president finally admitted in the out years that, in fact, the Iranians will be able to build a bomb. And he said the breakout time will have shrunk almost down to 0 by year 13. That means this deal allows the Iranian mullahs that have chanted death to America and Israel's destruction is non-negotiable, and they've been the #1 state sponsor of terror, and they've fought proxy wars against Israel. Now they're fighting one against Saudi Arabia. Should we have preconditions before we even sit down with the Iranians on all of these important issues? If they really want to join the world community, shouldn't we have some type of precondition?
I think if you want to have credible negotiations, you have to carry through with what the agreement is. And what disturbs me most is the foreign minister of Iran, immediately after the preliminaries came out on this agreement, he tweeted out in English that really he didn't believe any of the things that President Obama was saying that the agreement meant. So it's this disingenuousness, I think, really you wonder whether or not we can have an honest agreement with them if they're going to immediately trash the agreement and say it doesn't mean what everybody else believes it to mean. So I think lack of sincerity, lack of credibility is a real problem.
But in the midst of these negotiations, just 2 weeks ago, while they were still at the height of negotiations, the Iranians were chanting death to America. It was just a couple of days before the announcement was made that they came to this interim, quote, agreement, or the foundation of some agreement, that they said, one of their leaders actually went out there and said, Israel's destruction is not negotiable. If you are the president and those two